Hi everyone, welcome back to the AI language. So today's challenge is to make an infinite scroll view. Here is the scroll bar that you see on the right, and if I scroll down, you can see that the scroll bar is actually, getting smaller in size and the scroll is extending infinitely as much as I scroll down. And then I can scroll up again, and this time I have to scroll the full length up again because as you see that the scroll has increased in dimension. There is no direct widget for this in Flutter, and you might have seen such an infinite scroll for making infinite canvases in applications like OneNote for taking notes and applications like Figma for design. If you'd like to see more of such challenges and you like this challenge, please do consider subscribing to our channel before we move ahead. So first I'm going to visit the ailanguage.com/play. This is a Dartpad based Flutter playground. You can write your code on the left side over here in the window, and then you can actually click on the run button on the top right over here to see the output. Wait for the output and you should see a hello world text on this window, and this is basically my starting point for building the infinite scroll view. Now what we'll do is we'll replace this text hello world with our own custom widget called infinite scroll view. This is not a pre-existing widget in Flutter, and that's why you'll see an error at the bottom over here that this isn't defined. So we are going to define it next by defining it as a class infinite scroll view, and then let it extend a stateful widget so that we can have some state variables to define what is the state, especially the height that the scroll view is going to take, the controller, etc. So now we are going to define the first state variable, which is a child widget. So let's assign the type widget and name it child. We'll make this nullable so that if it's not provided, there can be a default value that we can put on later. And this is what the scroll widget will basically show as a child. Next, we'll define a double state variable, which is basically the start height. Since the height can actually vary for the scroll view, this is going to tell what the initial height of the scroll view is. Okay, so let's add these comments that this will be the widget we want to display in the infinite scroll view, and then the other value will be this some finite starting height for the scroll view. Since it can be infinite height, so we want to fix some starting height, which we'll assign later. So now we'll start defining the constructor. Let's put an const constructor infinite scroll view, and then we put the parenthesis. Let's put the curly braces to denote optional arguments over here, and then first is the super dot key, and then we'll put the child widget, and lastly we'll put the start height. We'll make this a required parameter, so it's not nullable. So next, let's override the create state method below the constructor over here. We write override, we return an object of type of the state class and return an object in the method which is called create state. And this is our create state method for the state of this widget. Now let's create this class. So write class infinite scroll view state, and then let's make this extend the state of the widget infinite scroll view. Alright, so now we have the state class. So now let's override the init state method for the state class. Write void init state parenthesis, and then let's call the super method over here. Now let's override the build method. Write widget build, and then provide the build context as the function argument. And for now, we'll return a single child scroll view. And for the child property of the scroll view, we'll assign a simple text hello world. Now we need to provide a starting height for this infinite scroll view. So let's replace this with a scaffold. As we don't want to directly use the infinite scroll view, we'll put this inside a scaffold body. Let's use a body over here and put a container first. Inside the container, let's provide a child. This child is going to be a layout builder. And for the builder property, we provide a function which takes the context and constraints. These constraints help us to determine the available height. And now we can actually define the starting height over here that we want to provide to the scroll view as constraints.max height. Now we can return the infinite scroll view from here, passing in the start height as the required parameter. So this is what we have on the right now, an empty screen with the hello world on the top. Let's add 100 over here so that there's some initial scroll available, but we'll not see the scroll till we actually connect this height start height to the child of the single child scroll view. So let's add a container over here. Let's add a child, which is this text, and let's add the height parameter as widget.startHeight. The widget has a small w. And now we need to add constraints for the minimum container height. And we do that by adding box constraints and specifying the minimum height to be widgets.startHeight. And now you can actually run the code. And when you do that, you'll see that you have a scroll view that's available. And you can scroll up and down because the minimum height has now been specified as start height. And the start height is 100 points more than the maximum available height. So there you have the scroll view. Let's also specify min width equal to double dot infinity. And this basically makes the container expand across the available width on the screen so that the scroll comes on the extreme right of the screen rather than somewhere on the left side. And now we see that the scroll is available on the right side and we have this scroll bar that we can scroll up and down with. All right, so now we'll actually add our first state variable for this widget, which is a scroll controller. And we'll start it with an underscore because it's a private variable and call it a scroll controller, simply a scroll controller. And we'll make it late, which means that, we'll initialize it later. It's non-nullable, but it's not initialized in the beginning. And now we are going to initialize this scroll controller inside the init state method by just simply initializing it with the scroll controller constructor. And then we are going to add a listener. Let's call that listener on scroll. Now we have to define the on scroll listener below this. So it's a simple listener with a return type of void. And so what we want is that whenever there's a scroll event, we want to check, is the user extending the scroll downwards? So let's make a function called isUserExtendingScroll that is fired whenever there's a scroll event that checks for this. And basically this will take in the scroll controller and then let us know, whether the user is extending the scroll or not. Now let's define this function, the return type of bool. So it'll either say true or false. And it just takes in the scroll controller as the argument. And inside the function, we will basically check the scroll controller position for a few parameters or properties. And based on that, be able to tell whether the user is trying to extend the scroll downwards or not. The first is to check whether the scroll position is at one of the edges or not. The next is that we don't want the position to be at the beginning edge. So we put a not condition and we check whether the position pixel property is equal to 0 or not. So if it's equal to 0, we don't want that to be true. So we put a not of that condition. And lastly, we check using the scroll controller if the user is trying to scroll down or up. So we use the scroll controller dot position dot scroll direction. So we check for user scroll direction and that should be equal to scroll direction dot reverse. So we need to include the correct import file for that. And this is available in Flutter rendering. So we're going to add this on the top right there. And to make this more readable, we can break these three conditions inside the single return statement into different variables. So the first one would be is at edge, and we'll copy the first condition over there. This tells us if the scroll position is at one of the edges, the top or the bottom edge. Second one, we can make a variable is at start edge. So we know that if the scroll controller's position is the top edge or not. So we take this condition, paste it over there. And lastly, we check if the user is trying to extend the scroll, that is, they're trying to scroll down. And we copy this last condition for this particular variable. Now we can replace these conditions by simply the variables that we have defined for them. Now we put all three. Now we'll assign the controller to the single child scroll view so that we can actually get the scroll position for that particular scroll view. So now what we want to do is that we want to use this particular fact, whether the user is extending scroll or not, to actually then change the height for the container inside the scroll view. So we want to say if the user is trying to extend the scroll using this if condition, let's call a function called extend height, which will help us extend the height of the scroll view. The scroll view itself doesn't provide any height constraints. So in effect, we basically will update the height for the container inside the scroll view. Now let's define a container height variable, which is a state variable which can change. And let's assign it a value of 0 to begin with. We'll use this variable to define the height for the container in the scroll view. We also define an incremental height where that is the amount of height we want to increase the container height by whenever the user tries to scroll down. So let's put it at 200 pixels for now. All right, so now we can define the extend height function. Let's define it with a return type of void. And inside the function, we basically use the container height and increment it by the incremental height that we have supplied above. This will happen every time we call the extend height function. And now we basically use a set state method. Let's copy the statement inside the set state. Also, if the container height is less than the start height, we update the container height to be equal to the start height so that we always start from that particular height and start incrementing the height above that. So now we have the extend height function. So now we are mostly done. We just need to assign the constraints to the container correctly to use the container height. So remove the height property and just specify the minimum height over here. If the container height is less than the widget start height, we basically use the start height, else we use the container height. And this helps us to basically solve for the initial case where the container height is 0. Now we run it and we can check it out. There you have your hello world. And if you scroll down, you can see that the infinite scroll view is working, and it will keep on extending the height of the container as you keep on scrolling down, and then you can scroll up all the way up to see that the scroll is now much longer, and you have the hello world at the top, and you can as and when you scroll down, it'll increase the size of the container that is basically holding your content inside the scroll view. So that's it for this infinite scroll view. You can get this code at this particular link, the ailanguage.com/play/infinite scroll view. It is free for our subscribers, so just subscribe to our channel and log in with the same Google account at the ailanguage.com at this particular link. Do like the video and please subscribe and share it with your friends.